Well, good evening, everyone. Coming out on such a warm, sunny day. It's wonderful to see you all. Thank you again for coming out to the Center for Presidential History and SMU up here on the hilltop for another one of our, I wouldn't say monthly, they originally were supposed to be monthly, but we seem to do many more of them. Lectures exploring presidential history, presidential memoir, and some of the critical issues facing both the historical community and, of course, the present world today. This is a really fun one tonight because it's personal and it's special. And you know, we spend a lot of our time at the Center for Presidential History doing all facets of history, going all the way back, to the very beginning of George Washington. And we, last week or so, have been spending a lot of time in the very, very modern era. As many of you attended, and I appreciate that, we had a session last week looking at our oral history of the decision by President Bush in 2006 to surge troops in Iraq, which is the first time that we basically have all of the policymakers, and I mean all the policymakers, who were involved in that decision come together to give their memories. And it really gives a sense of how we have some of our students who are working and fellows who are working on Washington and Jefferson, the 19th century, and then we also have people who are working on the history that doesn't even feel like history that feels like something that perhaps you woke up and couldn't remember if you did it or not. And that's what we're talking about today, something that's much, much more recent and something that's much more dramatic. Before we get to that, I do want to say that one of the reasons why this is such an exciting personal event for us is that it's not often, we oftentimes get to introduce, friends and colleagues, but not always partners. And we are partners, the Center for Presidential History, with Essential History Expeditions on a really fascinating tour of the D-Day invasion experience, soup to nuts. Operation Overlord from London through Normandy, through Paris, basically taking both students, it's a regular SMU student course, and friends of the university, which you may define broadly. I don't like to say alumni, because you don't have to be an alumni. And I don't like to say adults, because that suggests something about the maturity of these students. So let's just say friends of the university. Take them together on an intergenerational conversation that explores this epic moment in global history. And when we first got the idea of doing this, I called up one of my former students who was with me at Texas A&M and who was then teaching at West Point, and I said, you guys in the Army do a lot of this stuff, walk in battlefields. Who do you use? And he said, the Pentagon. I said, okay. Who else might you recommend? And he said, I know just the guy. He said, there's nobody else in the world better than Colonel Brian DeToy to lead you on these tours of battlefields and to set every part of the experience up for you with his wife, Cheryl. And I have to say that was the single best piece of advice I've gotten in years and years and years. I will not ever go on another history tour without these guys, which means you should go with them too. This is all building up to a big advertisement that next year we're going in May again. I encourage you to check out some of the information that we have at the front desk. It's really a fascinating opportunity to have an intergenerational conversation about history and also to do some things that are genuinely once-in-a-lifetime experiences. Now, many of you may have been to Normandy, many of you may aspire to go to Paris or London, but one thing that we're doing this year I want to stress is spending the evening on Mont Saint-Michel. If you have never done this, you literally have not lived. So I encourage you, come with me if you want to live. And it's one of those experiences, you're all familiar with Mont Saint-Michel. It's obviously an incredibly historic monastery, basically built on a tidal rock, if you will. And when you go during the day, it's basically like going to Disney World because you are packed that tight in with tourists from all across the world, and you basically can't turn around until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon when they leave. And about 300 people every night get to spend the night on the rock. Trust me, this is something you want to do. So come with us, you'll have that experience. Let me turn to the topic at hand then, which is Colonel DeToy's research from back in his time He spent his career as an Army officer and also in Army education, having a PhD from Florida State. Am I still done? Okay. And has been an expert on 19th century history, on 18th century history, and also on 20th century history, and also worked for their strategic studies program up at West Point. And he is a person who had a military career of his own as a historian. That is to say, documenting in real time the history of the Iraq occupation by the United States and its allies. And that is what he's here to talk about tonight. It really gives me great pleasure to introduce not just a partner, but a friend. If you please join me in welcoming Colonel Brian DeToy.
That's the definition of a mic drop right there. This is here.
I'm going to look for a stand.
Yep.
I'll look for a stand.
That's right. All right, how's this now? Yeah. So real quick, this photo, we're going to turn it off in a sec here, is me and my best friend from high school. He was an Air Force pilot, and on March 3rd, 2010, we got to fly together on an all-night mission in Iraq, and that was really incredibly special. So we'll come back to that later, but now I need this to move across slides. Yeah. All right, I'm going to read to you two poems. First is from Shakespeare's Henry V, and the young king is at the siege of Harfleur. It's in 1415. He's trying to inspire his army. They've just failed, have been repulsed in storming the besieged town. Once more under the breach, dear friends, once more, or close up the wall with our English dead. In peace, there's nothing so much becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favored rage, then lend the eye a terrible aspect. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slip, straining upon the start. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge, cry God for Harry, England, and St. George. Second is by Billy Rose in the 1930s. There's a graveyard near the White House where the unknown soldier lies, and the flowers there are sprinkled with the tears from mother's eyes. I stood there not so long ago with roses for the brave, and suddenly I heard a voice speak from out the grave. I am the unknown soldier, the spirit voice began, and I think I have the right to ask some questions, man to man. Are my buddies taken care of? Was their victory so sweet? Is that big reward you offered selling pencils in the street? Did they really win the freedom they battled to achieve? Do you still respect the croix de guerre above that empty sleeve? Does a gold star in a window now mean anything at all? I wonder how my old girl feels when she hears a bugle call. I am the unknown soldier, and maybe I died. And my country called. I'd do it all over again. You can hear the difference between those two, can't you? Both are poems of war, but they evoke completely different responses and emotions. In November 1921, 3 Medal of Honor winners, awardees, carried the casket of the unknown soldier to its final resting place there in D.C. at the new memorial. One of them was Major Charles Whittlesea, 37 years old and commander of what we call the Lost Battalion in World War I. In October, 3 years earlier, his unit had got way in front of the American lines and got cut off, surrounded for 6 days. His calm, cool leadership got them through, and until finally they were relieved. But he was haunted for the rest of his life. He'd lost over 60% of his men, killed, captured, and wounded. A few days after that ceremony in D.C., He boarded a cruise liner in New York for a vacation trip to Cuba, Havana. On the first night out from port, he got up from the card table, bid everyone good night, and he recalled that he was in good spirits. He went to his cabin, came out again a short time later, and at some point walked to the back of the ship and leaped out into the cold North Atlantic. His body was never found. Though no one used the term, Whittlesea suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. His old regimental commander said as much in his eulogy, proclaiming that Whittlesea was the final victim of that lost battalion. When I served in Iraq, we had more death by suicide and other non-combat related incidents than from combat. The military had over 320 suicides in that year, 2009-10. It continues to this day. Understanding the history of war matters. The strategic and tactical details are important to preserve, analyze, and understand. The human cost is also important to understand as well. Historian embedded in a war zone captures all of this important information. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm delighted to be here and look forward to your questions afterwards. I know you had a phenomenal talk just last week discussing the surge, last card in the deck, and that's a tough one to follow. Thank you, Jeff, for inviting me to do so. Tonight we're going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of history and where it's made and collected at the tip of the spear. Here's the thing. History matters. Americans deserve to know, you deserve to know, what happens for your blood and your treasure. You deserve to know what is being done and accomplished in your name. People have been writing about military history for thousands of years. Some of the names there, Thucydides, Herodotus, Arrian, Caesar, right on up to the present. Some of the greats up there. Before a stake was named for him, here's what one young Frenchman, René Chateaubriand, had to say in 1807 about the political leadership in his day. When in the silence of abjection, the only sounds that can be heard are the chains of slaves and the voice of the collaborator, when everything trembles before the tyrant, when it says dangerous to curry his favor as to merit his disgrace, well, then the historian appears, charged with the vengeance of the peoples. Nero prospered in vain, for Tacitus was already born during the empire. Nero is fiddling, destroying his country. Rome is burning. However, the great historian Tacitus, born at that time, in his words, long after Nero's death, will tell the true story and how we remember Rome. Historians are like Tacitus. He's talking of Nero and the Romans. 17 centuries later, Chateaubriand is talking of the future historian born at that time who will avenge France and Europe from Napoleon. And historians born today will write about the times of Bush and Obama. The truth will come out. A little bit of background about me, so you understand who I am when I get to Iraq. I'm an Army kid, grew up, born in Okinawa during the Cuban Missile Crisis, moved around on different tours with my family. My father, career NCO, loved history, shared that passion with me. We visited battlefields and other historical visits, especially when we were on the East Coast. I was a history major in college at Notre Dame and commissioned in the infantry in 1985. With this photo, I just want to highlight the stuff that's on this sleeve here and right here. That's an airborne ranger with also air assault wings and an expert infantry badge. And I say that just because that gives me instant credibility walking into a room. They're like calling cards. So I'm not just a historian, infantryman as well. My 24-year career prior to going to Iraq, I moved back and forth between combat infantry and educational academics, teaching at West Point. Got one of my West Point grads, Nikki Hernandez, here today, who came up from Fort Hood. She was in my last class of 2013. She was there standing on the hilltop the day I retired. At West Point, I became the staff right guru kind of guy, go-to guy, led military and civilian students all over the Eastern Coast, all over Europe, visiting battlefields every summer and on spring breaks. Gave them context for understanding previous wars so that current soldiers, cadets, and leaders can learn the lessons of the past, form the doctrines of the future. Back out in the regular Army in 2000, I deployed as second in command of a 560-man battalion to the Egyptian-Israeli border. We did peacekeeping. And while there, I led staff rides of Allenby's 1917 campaign at Beersheba, broke the German-Turkish line in 1917, and also the capture of the old city of Jerusalem in 1967 Six-Day War. For me, it was interesting. I got to teach Western Civ through the University of Maryland, too, so freshman Western Civ class for my soldiers. Climbed Mount Sinai. We did the class on Judaism and the rise of Christianity as we climbed Mount Sinai. Talked about the Crusades in an old Crusader castle. In the University of Kansas. Did that for 3 years, and I went to Fort Leavenworth to run the Research and Publications Division of the Combat Studies Institute. It's a premier Army history organization. And I had 7 historians, 3 editors, and we wrote 22 books that year, 2004-05. And we hosted a conference in the fall of 2004 that brought in senior military leaders and academics from around the country. It's called Turning Victory into Success. We'd been in Iraq for a year and a half then. Things were not going as well as planned. And this conference was to discuss how we can turn that military victory into long-term success, because they're not always the same. Lessons of the past will form the doctrines of the future. I returned to West Point in 2005 and was selected next year as a permanent professor there, working through a new program we developed, Defense and Strategic Studies. And then in the late spring of 2009, I got a call asking if I wanted to be the command historian in Iraq for half a year. And I jumped at the chance. I'd been looking to go, was already thinking about an Afghanistan trip. In the middle of October 2009, I go through a 1-week pre-deployment cycle, 1 week at Fort Benning, Georgia. This is the night before the flight. 10 years ago tonight, October 30th, 2009, I landed in country. 10 years ago tonight. 250 of us, all individual augmentees. It's very different than a unit deployment. I mean, we didn't know each other. We hadn't been training for a year together. Everybody's individuals going out to do individual jobs when you get there. Flown from Fort Benning to Bangor, Maine, and on down into Kuwait City. And on landing that night, I'm called forward and said, hey, you're going to be the convoy commander for this 40-mile drive down in the desert out to intermediate staging base. Not a big deal, actually, but it gave me 2 magazines. I had my pistol already, but here's 2 magazines of live ammunition. Keep an eye on the driver. 4 magazines, hand out to 2 guys on each of the other 5 buses. Stuff just got real, I thought, except that I didn't say stuff. At a midpoint break, another bus shows up coming the other way in the opposite direction. Our bird is now their freedom bird, we call it, as they're heading home after their tour of combat duty. Finally, deep in the middle of the night, we arrive at the airfield and bed down for the few hours. The next morning, we fly up the Tigris to Baghdad. So real quick, Iraq, and here's Afghanistan I'll be talking about too. Also Iraq itself, we're down here in Kuwait. We fly up to Baghdad, up in here, and I'll be talking to you. Mosul's up top, and to the southern part of the country down here to Basra. This just shows some of the bases that we still had in theater there in 2009. There's a lot of them all over the country, up and down. Here's Baghdad. This is the Baghdad International Airport. That is the American main base camps around it, completely surrounding it. I'm on Camp Victory, which is right here. And then down in here is the green zone, right downtown on the Tigris River. That's where the U.S. Embassy is. My home for those next 6 months is Victory Base Camp. Several huge American bases that circle that airport. Victory Base Camp is home to the major American headquarters in Iraq, both the multinational force Iraq old palaces, Al-Fa. And on Saddam Hussein's. Everybody. MNFI, Multinational Force Iraq, is led by General Ray Odierno, big bald guy you've seen, former Army Chief of Staff. It's the issues and political issues, both in Iraq, in the theater, and back in the U.S. as well. Roughly 2,000 folks in his headquarters, including Navy and Air Force. Multinational Corps Iraq, led by Lieutenant General Chuck Jacoby, consists of his 1st Corps staff out of Fort Lewis, Washington, with some augmentation, including me. The focus of the Multinational Corps is operational, tactical, day-to-day fight, as well as support of the Iraqi people. Also roughly 2,000 soldiers in the headquarters, but we controlled an additional 100,000 U.S. all throughout the country. One of the major issues we'll face during my time as command historian is consolidation of these 2 headquarters into something called United States Forces Iraq. Having one major single headquarters control all operations up and down, tactical through strategic, and that will be problematic. There's some other major issues that are covered here that we'd be dealing with, and that is the command historian I'd be expected to cover and capture for posterity. Support for the Iraqi security forces. Since July 1st of 2009, they had taken the lead. We were now behind them supporting, and we pulled ourselves out of the cities throughout Iraq. It's a major change for us after 6 years of going where we wanted and doing what we wanted. Now we're the backup support team. One trip early on into Baghdad, I'm in a Humvee and we're driving in, and all of a sudden we got stopped at a stoplight. And for me, that was okay. But for the soldiers who were used to before just going through wherever they want, they were nervous sitting there because they're a target. And one of them said over the intercom, "I wish I could just fire off this machine gun and clear it all out so we could continue to drive." And I said, you got to get used to this idea. What we're seeing now is our success. Support for the Iraqi election process. The largest and most important elections to date were going to occur in January. This later slips to March 2010, but it's going to be for all of Parliament and local elections. My boss, General Jacoby, in one of the early meetings had this to say with some senior Iraqi election officials. One started by saying, "I have a question about election security." Jacoby broke in, he said, "The answer is yes. Now, what's the question?" And what he meant to say is that we are going to do everything possible to secure your elections. The polling places, the international observers, security around it, whatever it takes, we're going to be there and do it. Just tell us what you need. The drawdown of U.S. forces in Iraq, including our actual exit plan. This was entailed by the Status of Forces Agreement, the SOFA we call it. It was signed by Prime Minister Maliki and President Bush in 2008, and it mandated that we leave by December 31st, 2011. We wanted to leave a residual force, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, for a much longer period. President Obama was negotiating this for well over a year. But the Iraqis, number one, wanted us out, and two, in these new negotiations, they put restrictions on our troops, that our troops were no longer going to have the legal protections that they needed if anything happened. In any event, Arab Spring happening and the Iraqis are going along, everybody wants the U.S. out. So we had a hard timeline to meet and we had to plan. And it's a massive operation. Just in my short time, we removed 346 units, including 4 brigade combat teams, each one with 5,000 men and women, and thousands upon thousands of vehicles and other large pieces of equipment. One of my former students, 25 years old, 5'0", female quartermaster lieutenant, she ran the transportation center that everything came through. She was the linchpin for the entire operation, and I love that. Her sister at the same time was a helicopter pilot in Afghanistan. Their father was a 76 grad at West Point, never deployed for 20 years. He was the proudest person you ever saw of his daughters. Part of that drawdown plan is the merger I mentioned earlier, where the strategic and tactical headquarters will become one and the same. And that was the case in 2003 and 4 in the initial invasion when General Sanchez was there. And it didn't work out so well, we found. And we came back and built this multi-leveled headquarters. The other one's not robust enough to look up, down, sideways, and out at the same time. There's no filtering between minute tactical situations and the strategic. But we in MNCI and First Corps made this happen as smoothly as possible in the January-February period. Our staff had run all the day-to-day ops, and so we continue to do that in the merged organization. We just had to bring the strategic group along and help, and it worked. Suffice to say, the integrated staff was a work in progress throughout, and the old Corps staff did most of the heavy lifting. I don't say that because I was part of that. I was too short of a time, and I'm not a First Corps guy. It's not parochial. It's just what I observed. We also spent the final months in preparation for the TOA transfer of authority with our replacement corps. And that's going to be Third Corps, the Phantom Corps out of Fort Hood, Texas. And you may, their first advance party arrived first week of November 2000, 3 months before the rest of them, 2,000 guys. You may remember that as Texans, because on November 5th, Major Nadal Hassan shot and killed 13 and wounded 30 down at Fort Hood. We got that word with their advance party in Iraq. An incredible tragedy, and definitely put that unit on edge as it was going to deploy. And the last item of importance in our withdrawal planning was the switch of the U.S. main effort from us in Iraq to Afghanistan. We'd all watched President Obama give a major speech at West Point on December 1st. He was sending troops to Operation Enduring Freedom Afghanistan as a surge to protect the fragile gains being made there. At the same time, we would abide by the SOFA with Iraq and begin to downsize and shift efforts. For us, it was a new day. We'd been to major March 2003. And now we'd start sending equipment and support to Afghanistan. It was a bit like being in the Pacific or in Italy in World War II, and you wanted to be with Ike out in Normandy. Everything we're doing is important, but the air just got let out of the ball a little bit. So that's what we're doing. That's our main issue. In Iraq, I live, this is me and the previous historian, so I brought with me the keys to victory, and we thought that would work out. So we took a picture on top of the palace as we shook hands and headed out. I live about 15 minutes from the palace in a containerized housing unit. That's my door right there, and there's a blast T-wall behind it. Now, I've got my own room. I've got a single room, and every morning as I left my house, I would pat my Notre Dame, play like a champion today, go to work. Those surrounded by those concrete walls, those are blast walls called T-walls, and they're meant to protect us from all but an absolute direct hit into our small area. Showers and toilets, we don't have them. They're outside, out in the open central area, and we're rocketed and mortared every week. Several people will be killed and wounded while on that base while I'm there. In the palace, I typically work 12, 14-hour days. I've got my own little office, unlike almost everyone else, certainly of lieutenant colonel grade in the headquarters, who work in large shared spaces. These are two actual sayings that were on the doors of the planning session. So the planners, lieutenant colonels and majors, are just doing unbelievable yeoman's work. Iron colonels and majors doing daily nonstop drudge of a staff. They're like oarsmen on the chained to a slave galley. But they did unbelievable work. I, however, am left to my own devices for the most part. Other things in Iraq here, I'm left to smoke cigars up on top of the palace. This is that young 25-year-old lieutenant who was in charge of all the equipment being moved out. Playing some sports, staying fit. I'll say this guy here, Major General Price, he and I played on a basketball team in our 40s with the 20-year-olds. It didn't work so well. When we were 20, we played together at West Point. I could bring the ball down court as a point guard, throw the ball up, and then he would come in with a thunder jam and just slam it down. We did it 5 times a game. Not as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I ever was. So Barry would say, Brian, once a game, one time a game, let's do it. That was it. But for the most part, I was left to my own devices. I say that because for care and feeding purposes, I'm assigned to the Red Team. The mission of the Red Team is a fairly new concept in the military, and here's what it is. Provide the commander with an independent capability to explore alternatives in plans, operations, concepts, organizations, and capabilities in order to fully account for the operational environment from perspectives of partners, adversaries, and others. It's a big mission. It's comprised of 2 full colonels, 2 lieutenant colonels, a major, and a sergeant major. Problem for the colonel in charge is that none of them are really truly prepared to do the analytical rigor. And he knows that this historian did yeoman's work providing that framework for them, and thus he insists I join in as well. It's going to take me away from my historian's job, but it's a way that I can contribute, and off I do. And that's what I do a lot of for much of the day. I've known him since we were lieutenants many moons ago, and so I'm with him in this role. His people are really pretty lost, and he's lost himself. He's a great combat leader, but he was not the best staff leader himself. And that's what happens. Not everybody is. And then as a Red Team, we're hit with our last major issue, the joint campaign plan between the U.S. forces, military, and the U.S. Embassy. It's for the drawdown and exit out of Iraq. Hundreds of pages long, lots of analysis. General Jacoby, our boss, tasked the Red Team to, quote, analyze the Joint Campaign Plan for risks. What are the problem areas in the plan, and how might we mitigate them? That's big. So finally, the other colonels, we mess around for a few days, then they come to me and say, find something we can do. And I decided we can do it, but the way you eat an elephant, just one bite at a time. And we break it down, and we create 6 to 8 page reports called Red Team Observation and Perspectives. Give ourselves about 10 days to produce these things. We start out, we have 21 major issues. We start out with what we call a bog set. As you can see on the photos here, it's a bunch of guys and gals sitting around talking. And so you heard that term all the time. Hey, a bog set, everybody in. And we get started, we assign into bite-sized chunks, and then the lead collates and writes a report. While that's happening, we're already starting the next bog set, getting ready. And it works beautifully. And I'm able to break myself away and start doing my historian job. One last thing on the Red Team is because of my relationship with them that I went down to the embassy as often as I did, every couple of weeks. I was there in one of these meetings to deconflict state and defense roles in the Joint Campaign Plan that I saw some of that friction between the two up front. It was a meeting at one of the state officers took huge chunks of the campaign plan and said, I'm putting these tasks that don't concern USFI, military, into our who gives a crap bin. Meaning we, the state, aren't going to bother with that. You guys have written this great plan, but we're not going to bother with it. There were 3 very high-ranking state officials in the room, about 20 of us total. They didn't say a thing. Some of them couldn't wait for us to get out of Iraq, and they were wanting to start their diplomacy. They were not Joint Campaign Plan were waiting us out, like the Iraqis and the Iranians were doing. And that was a bit of an eye-opener. Now, earlier I said people have been writing about military history for thousands of years, and that's true. However, it wasn't until World War II that the U.S. military truly focused on the importance, even the criticality of historical study and scholarship to our success. And first in the Pacific in '43, this man here, later a general, but a Colonel S.L.A. Marshall, pioneered a technique of group and command interviews with units fresh out of combat. Lessons learned approach meant that lessons could be quickly shared across the entire force. We still do that today. The next year in '44, the Army created entire teams of historians and assistants to move with Army-sized units, conduct Marshall-style interviews while also capturing the big picture at major headquarters. Marshall himself came to Europe and ran one of the teams. But his technique isn't foolproof. Who here has read or seen Band of Brothers? Read the book or seen, right? So Dick Winters was brought to Marshall for an interview a couple of days after the Breakcourt Manor episode. Seemed like an amazing small unit action. Winters would later earn the Distinguished Service Cross for it. However, when he showed up for the interview, Winters, his battalion and brigade commanders and other senior staff were in the room too. They wanted to hear about it. Winters did not want to puff himself up, and so he really downplayed the actions, especially his own. Marshall was a bit deflated, disappointed. The story was lost for decades. So even with soldiers in an action talking about it days later, can't always ascertain ground truth. In the larger picture, though, the end result of this World War II historian endeavor, we have an incredible narrative of events, some published in the interim, some months, many years and years later, up to 15 to 20 years, the famed Green Book series, still to this day a gold standard of military history. Every unit in the Army, battalion and higher, received a complete copy. Officers for decades would pore over them to glean insights, lessons, sometimes for just plain inspiration, and that's part of what history does. Over the next decades, Korea and Vietnam, the Army continues this process, but then it sits fairly idle for a long time. We're not in big wars, not until 2001. It's atrophied. We did send in a large, robust team with the initial invasion in 2003. Lots of historians and assistants, 60 guys. And they wrote a superb interim book called On Point. But then we broke it up. We didn't continue with it, failed to follow through with the effort. But that conference in 2004, Turning Victory into Success, jumpstart a new focus. Army began to organize its historians for the longer war. It won't be over in another 18 months as the mantra had been. Each 6 months, 18 months kept being pushed out. But by 2009, we're back into the game. We have a command historian at multinational force with General Odierno. He's a friend of mine. He's also an old hand from the history department. But Odierno does not give him good access, and so he hands distance at that senior strategic level. I am the command historian at Multinational Corps Iraq. And here's the structure of how my team was organized. as we recorded history in the midst of it. I got 21 people, soldiers, civilians, working with and for me. I've got a civilian who's at 1st Corps headquarters, focuses on the Corps mission, those 2,000 men. I have 4 civilian historians out with each of the combat divisions in the field. They and the 1st Corps historian are part of those unit staff, and they deployed with them. They've known them from home station. I have 5 military history detachments in theater, 1 for each of the 4 combat divisions. That's the 3rd Infantry, 25th Infantry, 34th Infantry National Guard Unit, and the 1st Cavalry Division out of Fort Hood, as well as the Theater Sustainment Command, which was division size for logistics. These are comprised of 2 officers, Lieutenant Colonel Major and a non-commissioned officer. And their mission is to collect information, documents, orders, plans, maps, photographs, oral histories related to actions at these lower levels. For instance, say a company is out on a mission and it finds a major find of enemy weapons and equipment after a raid. Well, then the military history detachment might descend upon that unit, do its work in telling that story in detail. These detachments are really the hunter-gatherers of the material that will feed the larger historical writing machine. The Army identified some issues with these military history detachments during this war in Iraq, Afghanistan. Sometimes commanders misuse them as additional staff. Hey, there's a major, let's put him to work over here. He's not doing something important. And there was an unfocused, unfiltered gathering of materials, which means terabytes of data without focus or structure were brought back to the U.S., and therefore the quality and usefulness remains problematic to this day. And let me say I fully concur with that statement. In the past, field historians really had to be surgical in their selection of material gathered for the historical record. Mountains of paperwork in Normandy or in Okinawa, World War II, or Saigon in Vietnam meant that a historical team had to have a well-thought-out plan about what to go in and get. But today's historian, with a computer, security access, and a portable server, can pretty much download every item produced every day. And that's exactly what many military history detachments did, and to an extent as well in the senior headquarters. Much of my time had been pulled away from the history job into the red team. I was doing valuable work, but that meant my regime, my protocol was grab everything else. I had particular reports and briefings I pulled down every day, intel operations, but for much of the others, I might just grab it all. Don't want to leave. Under pressure time, it's safer to grab everything, which means that future historians doing the writing will have a lot of sifting as they wade through it. However, it must also be said that today what we gathered is the most extensive operational record ever kept. One of the ways my predecessor and I helped future historians work through all this is through our quarterly command reports. That was the most important thing that we had to produce for the higher headquarters, and our higher headquarters was Central Command, based out of Tampa, Florida. Narrative, telling the story of what we had done that quarter, about 55 to 60 pages, single-spaced, went under the commander, the Lieutenant General's signature, back to Chief of Staff of the Army. In that report, we footnoted every single line, linking the statement to a much more detailed secret or top secret report or briefing document that would enable future historians to delve more deeply into the topic, like a Hansel and Gretel map for them to follow the breadcrumbs, decide what ought to be read first and what ought to be declassified first. So a bit earlier I mentioned security clearances. That leads to just a quick, short discussion of challenges in this field. You can see the guy on the left is top secret. The guy on the right only has confidential clearance, and he can't see the good stuff. In the combat zone or anywhere back making plans, it's easier simply sometimes to classify things as secret and top secret. You're worried about something being lowered. They're not necessarily nefarious, it's just an easy way out. It's the default classification. Some things by protocol must be classified that way, but others, people have some choices. It's just easier. Again, it's not nefarious, it's just you're leading on the side of security. But it becomes more difficult to declassify later. Experts have to try and figure out why something is classified the way it is and determine if it makes sense to declassify now. Otherwise, we may have to wait 50 years till it's almost all declassified, not everything. And obviously, this affects research, writing, and publication. Some of you may have seen this from the last couple of days. Photo of the military working dog, the Baghdadi raid. He's released, but the dog's name is still classified. But why? Because that dog, that name is revealed, can lead to identification of his handler. And that person might tell us what unit was involved, and so who's out there in the theater. So a lot of information can be brought from small things. All right, let me talk about the Army historical program and how that works in the theater. It is the foundation for Army training. So lessons from the past are going to form the doctrines of the future. Army relies on this program to preserve the institutional memory of the Army, write the official history in combat, and provide historical support in decision-making. Now, it must be said clearly, military history does not produce solutions for problems, does not guarantee success on the battlefield. Rather, history affords an understanding of the dynamics to shape the present and enable soldiers perspectives of viewing current and future problems with ideas of how similar challenges were confronted in the past. For example, the Army's response to counterinsurgency campaigns has insights on the new threats in the 21st century. If history rarely provides concrete answers, it does offer insight and understanding. It promotes how to think, not necessarily what to think. I kind of like this metaphor of history takes the film of the past, runs it through the projector of the present, out onto the screen of the future. The history of Army operations and activities is not written for public affairs purposes. It's not shaped to reflect particular viewpoints, program goals, or agendas. Anything less than the truth, total disservice to the soldiers whose actions are documented, and those who must learn from them, as well as the integrity of the Army as a whole. Within this Army program, the field historians, which I was in Iraq, are the focal point. Collect, preserve, present the Army's history. Interact daily, command and unit activities, staff meetings, operations. We are expected to be experts in military history, but also much more. Got to know Army doctrine, organization, plan and coordinate staff, and serve on combat staffs as advisors. In regard to the history, the commander, not me as commander, but the commander, his important responsibility is provide me with direct access to all commanders and their staffs. I mentioned Odierno did not do that with his guy. His guy did not. When Odierno says, no, you're not going to talk to me, his guys below him said, well, you don't have to talk to me either. I didn't have that. General Jacoby formerly taught history at West Point. He knew the value. And so he gave me complete access in spades. And because he was available to me, everybody else had to be available to me. Equally important, field historians provide insight into past operations and apply this to the current one. In regard to this last one, bringing historic insights from the past, I was once asked, provide examples, one page per example, of times when units were outnumbered and isolated and still fought their way to victory. Could I provide 6 to 8 examples of those types of small unit actions? I said, yes, sir, I can do that, but I can also provide 10 times that number when units were isolated, outnumbered, and were overrun and destroyed. Sometimes you get the history you ask for. That request, by the way, came from the commanding general, and he was trying to provide various types of support for the growing operations in Afghanistan. The Taliban was making significant inroads throughout the country, and widely separated cops or combat outposts were being isolated and attacked. So I'd written those things up in 2010. Jumping forward, May 2016, I was at a wedding in Ohio. One of my former cadets, captain, getting married. I was there. I was standing in the line after the wedding, and I'm in the drinks line. It's a long drinks line. It's going to take me way too long to get this drink. And I see an officer approaching from the side. He's got on his dress blues. And he's got 2 glasses of wine. He says, sir, I got one for you, and I'd like to thank you. And I said, great. I stepped out of the line, and I said, well, what do you want to thank me for? He said, well, you may not remember me, but I was on one of your staff rides to Gettysburg in 2006. Immediately, I remembered that one because I knew these guys were all seniors then in 2009. And that staff ride was in the pouring rain, 30 degrees, wind coming in sideways. I lost my voice. It was perfect. It was great. And so we laughed about that for a second. Then he said, listen, he looked down, and he looked back up, and he said, sir, I don't want to make too much of this. But in 2010, I was on an outpost in Afghanistan, and we were surrounded, and it was a bad, bad day. He said, I kept thinking about that time in Gettysburg. We were talking about a little round top, and you were telling us about whoever holds on 5 minutes longer, whoever holds on 30 seconds longer can win. You've got to stick your foot in the ground and stick it out. And he said, I didn't go around and tell my men that, but I went around and kept us in the fight. But in my head, I was thinking Gettysburg the entire time. I pulled up to me, hugged him long and hard, and let him go without a word. And I went outside and called Cheryl, and I cried. So sometimes writing those things does help. Another issue today, Army, this historical program, is we rely on this digital documentation. We use information technology and digital systems for planning, transmission of orders, plans, reporting, official, unofficial communication. In recent conflicts, everything we do is digital. Unfortunately, command oftentimes overwrite those documents as new information becomes available, or they delete files, conserve system storage space. And again, not nefarious, just as a practical matter. Often an outgoing unit will just wipe everything for the incoming unit. And because of those trends, historical documents are available now numerous. They're very numerous, but they're perishable. For that reason, we've been given access to copy documents throughout anybody's system. Lastly, an important part of the historical program is the need to protect as much as possible the history of the places in which we campaign. You may have seen the film Monuments Men. Well, there's a new one, just got started. This is the new style, came out last week, New York Times, where the Army announced formation of a new organization, Reserve Component Command Civil Affairs Unit, Fort Bragg, that will identify critical items before an operation and how to protect them. And hopefully this unit will ensure that we don't have a repeat of what happened in Iraq in 2003 when the priceless artifacts were looted. So, major components of the historian's work in the theater: interviews, commanders and key staff, active planning and participation on operational planning, and collection of archival data to bring back the collection. Interviews, I did a lot of these, perhaps 70 over my tour. Usually one-on-one to sometimes up to 4 of us in a room. I provide a list of topics and questions about 4 days in advance. Interviews sometimes would respond and say, hey, I don't like that question, or why don't you think about asking this question or this question? I'd rather talk about this important issue that you need to know about. And we would back and forth until we decided about what to go with. And then I was always prepared with follow-up questions. I had a tape recorder, notepad, pen for detailed notes. A couple of stories of those. Once I had a general come back the next day and say, hey, historian, I maybe shouldn't have said what I did yesterday. Talking about personalities and how things were working as integration. I maybe said some things about some higher-ranking generals. Maybe I shouldn't. I don't. And can I change what I said? And I said, no, sir, you may not. You know, that's for the record. That's exactly what you felt. That's what you meant. It's important that we know that from your position and what you do on the staff. But don't worry, I won't. General Odierno could come in here and demand that I give it to him, and I won't. I mean, this secret is not just a secret document. It's going forward. Historians will use it in the future. Don't worry about it. And they moved on. I had senior commanders were doing that integration piece. When we wanted to ask their opinion on it, said, okay, turn off that tape recorder right now. Turned it off. He saw that I was still writing, but then proceeded to lambaste the entire thing, but he just didn't want that his voice saying at that time. Went down south, flew down south to Camp Adder, down the southern part of Iraq, down by Basra, to meet with the MI Brigade commander. We moved them in early 2010 down south to combat what we said was Iranian influence. And it's leading up to the March elections. We're worried about Iranian influence already in the south, but now affecting all of the country. And so the Military Intelligence Brigade was down there, and I went down to talk to him and his staff. And it was great. On the way back, though, I decided to do something different. I decided to convoy back up. Instead of flying back, I wanted the experience of being on a convoy all the way through. It's about 5 hours. I said, great, I could do that. Instead of 1 hour flight, it's fine. Well, it took 13. And I was with this great National Guard. So that's right there at Camp Otter. That's the ziggurat of Ur. That's where Prophet Abraham is born, Mesopotamia. I'd mentioned before at Beersheba, that's Allenby's mine, but it's Beersheba in Israel, southern Israel. That's where Abraham dies. That's where his well is. And so in a space of 9 years, I was at the Alpha and Omega of Abraham in the Golden Crescent, or the Fertile Crescent. But anyway, from that spot, I'm going to convoy back. It's with the National Guard unit out of South Carolina. We had, hundreds and hundreds of major trucks to supplies taken up country, and we got this National Guard unit that's going to convoy them up. And I was going to be the senior. Everybody said, hey, you're the senior guy on this convoy. Do you want to get the briefing? I said, sure. I'm not in command of it, but I sat in and listened to their briefing, and it was a good briefing. I said, all right, here we go, security. In my vehicle, this is Staff Sergeant McConnell, She's 40 years old, highly successful real estate agent down in South Carolina, had joined the Army 8 years earlier with her 18-year-old daughter. The daughter promptly failed out of basic training. She made it through, went on. This is her third tour in Iraq. She was fantastic. Corporal Fields is our gunner there. All through the night, we're driving along just slow as can be and stopping, and dust is choking through. And they're talking, as young people do, about different topics, 99% of it sex, but different topics. And I remember distinctly the only time I heard bullets hitting vehicles that I'm in Iraq was that night. And that changes your focus of what you're thinking about at that time. But they were highly professional National Guard unit that did a fantastic job on that 13 hours back up to Baghdad. Did a lot of flying around Iraq, up country, down country, to do interviews with widely separated units and organizations. One time flying with C-130 of active duty guys. So these guys are young. They're like 27 years old, captains, lieutenants, and a C-130 is a decent size plane. And they're taking me up country, and they'd never been to this airfield before, and as they come around in the night, they don't like the landing, so they go around a second time. Now, the last thing you want to do is go around a second time, because then the enemy's got you targeted, and so that was not the best. The next time I was in a C-130 was with my best friend from high school. And I'd wanted to get up to Balad to interview the aviation brigade commander up in the central part of the country. And Jeff had said, I can take you up there. I'm a special ops pilot, got an MC-130, but you're going to have to stay with us all night. We're going to be dropping off SEALs and Green Berets and doing hits all throughout the country all night long. I'm like, well, awesome, sign me up. So meet him at the airfield in Baghdad, and we get off and we take off, and all night long. And I'm in the navigator's seat, so I got a perfect view out the front, big moon, and we spend the night dropping off teams, doing their mission, getting bad guys throughout the night. Winds up in Mosul were horrible. I remember we were coming in, crabbing in sideways until at the last second they flipped and landed. The team of that plane would give out a football if whoever had the best play of the day, and Jeff was pilot on that landing, and so he got the ball. As we're dropping these teams off and doing these missions, we're listening to the gold medal hockey game between the USA and Canada. Sidney Crosby scoring the winning goal, but just surreal to be doing that. But in the morning, they dropped me off where I needed to go. This, by the way, this is just Iraqi, it looks like sometimes almost like Iowa. Lots of greenery, just coming out into springtime. Planning phase, that's the other thing. So interviews was one of the things. Next one was being in planning phase. With operations focused on supporting Iraqi security, those security efforts to draw down and exit, there's not many opportunities for me to contribute historical battlefield campaign wisdom. Not to say those main efforts aren't important, exceedingly they were. However, my stock of support and drawdown tales was limited. I did, however, make a pithy remark when asked for input at the end of one marathon session. Colonels and Iron Majors were bleary and red-eyed, nerves were tad frayed, and the Chief of Plans said, "Historian, any words for us?" I said, "Just this, amigos." Eisenhower said, "In battle, plans are worthless." So we have the Supreme Allied Commander's thoughts on your efforts right here tonight. Folks around the room lift their heads toward me as they let that sink in, and before they bodily tossed me out, I said, "Wait." But he also said the act of planning is invaluable. And what he means is that no plan survives contact, either with the enemy, the terrain, or weather, or frankly with ourselves just getting out of the gate. But it's the act of planning, going through it, developing branches and sequels and options for when things go wrong, and they will. That's what's important. And so I concluded, your efforts have not been in vain. On a more serious note, I added this anecdote when we were discussing the exit plan. Especially we were looking at those last few months when the very last units are going to be pulling out of Iraq down to Kuwait, back down the river. That's when the plans and movements were probably going to be most fraught with danger. And I emphasized the need for strong security, backstops, etc. as we pulled out. As we make that last withdrawal, the enemy is going to take an opportunity to try to inflict some final, possibly significant damage. Enable them to claim a victory, because Iraq would be entering a new phase, critical one with our exit, maybe civil war. It would be an important point of contention to say who drove the Americans out. Would it be our partners in the Iraqi government, or would it be the Iranian-backed Sadr militias, as the old embers of Al-Qaeda, which was now a nascent, though we didn't recognize it, ISIS. So the example I used was the British withdrawal from Afghanistan, 1842. 16,000 British soldiers out of Kabul with some of their families. They lost 99% of their people within 20 miles. One soldier made it to India to tell the tale. Probably no more sobering tale than that of Elphinston's command. The third thing was securing the information, the data. One of the things I did that was, I think, important for social historians in the future is I was able to grab what we call the NIPR, the non-classified internet router. And that's, you know, a bunch of junk, some people would think. They said, sir, who's going to want that? Let's just delete it. And I said, historians, son, historians. The meal schedule at the dining facilities, class schedule at the gyms and education center, schedule of the conjunct marathons and half marathons that we did with cities back in the States, schedule of various USO guests from the governor of California, we called Arnold. The night we had the duo on stage of Anna Kournikova and Billy Ray, Achy Breaky Heart Cyrus. All of that. Frankly, saving that NIPR, for social historians, that's what they're going to be interested in. And that's going to be important in the future. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts, what the historical program is and how the historians went about gathering that raw material. So what do the military historians say about this effort at this point? Well, the team at Center for Military History wrote the first draft, and the Army released it publicly earlier this year. You can get it hard copy or order it online. Remember, it's still an interim history. When we wrote the history of the invasion in 2003, we wrote that initial thing by the end of that year. But we've gone through iterative processes. And what we've written now is still not the official Army history. But this is it, 1,300 pages, 2 books, 1,000+ declassified documents. The Iraq War has the potential to be one of the most consequential conflicts in American history. Shattered long-standing political tradition against preemptive wars. In the conflict's immediate aftermath, the pendulum of American politics swung to the opposite pole with deep skepticism about foreign intervention. These are some of the main points out of it. Short war assumption was overly optimistic, created larger problems by pushing funding and manning for future projects because victory was always just 18 months away. We don't have to worry. The simultaneous transformation of the Army resulted in fewer units, active units, available for deployment. So it would rely on National Guard for the first time since Korean War for major deployments. Half of all the brigades in Iraq in 2005, which was the most dangerous part of all, were Guard units. And at that time, they were less experienced, thrust into a critical time without resourcing. Leaders lacked a clear understanding of what mattered. They leaned too much on inputs rather than outputs. Sounds more like Vietnam, for example. Money spent, Iraqis trained, insurgents killed or captured. Rather than was there more cooperation with the locals or reduced attacks. Additional highlights, Army, not enough troops. At no point did the commanders have enough to simultaneously defeat the Sunni insurgency and Iranian-backed Shiite militias. And we failed to deter Iran and Syria. They both gave sanctuary and support to Shiite and Sunni militants respectively. And we never developed a strategy to stop it. Coalition warfare wasn't successful. Deployment of Allied troops had nice political value, was largely unsuccessful. The Allies didn't send enough, or they put too many restrictions on when and where they could be used. We failed to develop a self-reliant Iraqi force. It was under-resourced for most of the war. By the time I got there, it was going pretty well. They were now in the lead, and they were doing pretty well. But a premature decision to hand off the sovereignty to the Iraqis meant that we couldn't lean on the Iraqi military. They were leaning now onto their political masters, and we lost some of our control. We had an policy. We decided at the outset that these insurgents were not going to be prisoners of war. And we never developed an effective way to truly handle them because of that. And many of them were returned to the battlefield. And lastly, we learned that democracy doesn't necessarily bring stability. We thought that the interim elections in 2005 would have a kind of calming effect, democracy here, but instead it exacerbated the already there ethnic and sectarian tensions. So now, with that publication, we've begun to take a look, a longer view of the war in Iraq and the war on terror. It's going to still go on for many, many years. But for me, mid-March 2010, it's time for me to leave Iraq. My part in the historical collection mission was complete. We're now into that one new headquarters, and the old MNFI friend, my historian friend, had to con. My co-workers, nearly all of 1st Corps, had already left in February. Back to Fort Lewis, and 3rd Corps had arrived. For the last month I was there, I had pretty much unfettered access, time to fly where I want, see what I want. It's been great. I wish I could have stayed another couple of months, but I'm scheduled to depart after the March elections. My last handover with my predecessor lasted 4 days. I have nobody to turn it over to. I literally take everything out, shred the last documents, pack things up, send them out. Everything I have, terabytes and terabytes of information. I make 2 copies. One goes to Central Command Headquarters in Tampa, and the other one goes to the Center of Military History in D.C. And I lock the door. All I take back with me is my diary. Well, that and a small baggie of sand. I mean, I'd been sitting in the cradle of civilization, one of them there, between the Tigris and Euphrates. And so I picked up some sand from there. Persian Empire, Babylon, Alexander the Great, Byzantium, the Ottomans. Sand and the memories is what I needed. From Baghdad, it's back down to Kuwait, and then to Friedenberg to Leipzig, Bangor, Atlanta, and the bus back to Fort Benning. This is the first day back. I lost 29 pounds over there. You don't drink beer when you're there. Lose weight. Worked out twice a day. Next day, out processing took 2 hours, and then back on a bus up to back up to Atlanta, and waiting for a plane back to New West Point. My flight was delayed, so I got a beer. Went all the way down to my toes. I felt it. As I left Baghdad, we changed the operational name from Iraqi Freedom to New Dawn. I took this picture the day of those elections, because I went up there at darkness. I took about 30 photos every 10 minutes to see this first day of Iraq's elections and a new country come out. She's going to be on her own 2 feet. Well, 3 years later, ISIS came and we came back, and this time we helped the Iraqi military win their own war. They're the ones who went back into Fallujah and Ramadi. They're the ones who cleared the 2 million person strong city of Mosul. They're the ones who drove ISIS into Syria. With our help, make no doubt, with our help, critical help, but they did it. And we're still there today on the front lines, out on the frontier. Let me close a bit with a few thoughts. I'd like to return to where we began with those personal stories, combat and loss with Henry, unknown soldier, especially Charles Whittlesea. Each loss is personal. I've lost many, many friends, colleagues, comrades, former students. One of them is Tim Steele, 2009 grad, who went with me to Gettysburg, just as Nikki did, and we went there every year. Tim went there in 2009, a couple weeks before graduation and commissioning. I had my students write a reflection paper. What did this mean to them right before they were going out to be a lieutenant in the Army? These are Tim's last 2 sentences, the final 2 sentences of his final paper at West Point. Favorite time of day is 23:30 when Taps plays over the speakers in the hallway. For those few minutes, I stop and think of all those who've served and died for me. One day, we'll play at my funeral. And when it does, I hope I'm deserving of the honor and respect that it shows. There he is at Gettysburg here, and with his daughter, Liberty, right before he went on into combat, his 1-year-old daughter, he and his wife, Megan, had named Liberty, giving her a kiss before he gets on the plane. On his deployment, Tim is going to be killed. He's buried there at West Point. If I stand in front of that grave, I brought him off the plane coming back. I gave the eulogy at his funeral. And I stand in front of that today. I look out. I can see 7 other of my students in that one little area. I mean, they're at Arlington and other areas too, but just right there. It's one of the reasons I write history, so that Liberty will know how and why her father sacrificed for her and for all of us. Tim died for America. He died for the spirit that animates America. He died for these brothers and sisters of his. This is a Veterans Day 2009 in Alpha Palace, a naturalization ceremony. We had 157 soldiers, American soldiers from 60 countries come in, raise their right hands, and become American citizens. Amazing, amazing day. We also had in February some wounded warriors come back for Operation Proper Exit. These are young men and women who were so badly injured, damaged in their time in Iraq that they were not able to go back with their unit. I mean, they were flown out with probably little chance of living. This young man here is completely burned, missing both hands. Almost everybody up here is missing a leg or an arm. Another burn victim, she's missing a leg. But they came back, they brought them back so that they could leave the country on their own. They went back to the places where they were injured. They traveled and saw the country again. They never saw and experienced. That day was one of the most amazing days. I went and was hugging these guys afterwards, and I stepped on one. I said, "I'm sorry I stepped on your foot." And he said, "Don't worry, there's nothing there. It's good." They were just, the spirit was just amazing. That's America. These two events represent the American spirit and human resilience. We have to know our history, our American history, to get where we want to be. As David McCullough says, it's about human agency and contingency. We've had choices along the way, right from the very beginning. Didn't have to turn out the way it did. The question then is why? And here's an idea. We're a promise, America. Our declaration said azimuth. We're not there yet. We've been great, but we could be even better. It's never been greater than it is right now. And his best days, his greatest days lie ahead. We may never reach our full potential, but it's the journey and the striving that counts. It's the joy and the discovery of who we are, what we can be as a people. That's what matters. It's living up to the ideals that these young people fought for, these new Americans, these wounded warriors, and that is what we can do, each and every one of us. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Appreciate your attention, and look forward to any questions you may have.
We do have time for some questions. As always, if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone on other sides so we can record your voice for posterity, and I will let you, call your professor hat and do the Q&A yourself.
Questions? Anyone? Sir? What?
Can you talk about how hard it is to separate personal inflection and experience from the actual recording of history that's going on, and do it in a straight, honest, and direct fashion, and not have any outside influence come into it as a writer? I mean, I can appreciate that.
Yeah, about how do you keep your biases and opinions out, and that's the difficulty for all historians, especially when you're closer into things. What I write about, my research is 18th century British Navy and politics in the era of the French Revolution. I got some written. Jeff and others are writing about things right now today, and it's a little bit harder, but we all have those. It's you got to fight against it. And whenever you find yourself maybe something creeping in. And I'll just say this about my time in Iraq. It was not a war that I was looking for back in 2003. It was not something that I personally thought maybe we should do. But as a serving soldier, you go and do as you're told. And so even though I had that bias in the back of my head maybe, I don't think it ever came up with me as I'm writing about what we're doing at the time. Another bias, though, is going to be you're wanting to tell the story of the what we're doing, and my job is to tell the story of the American forces there. And I know these people. I work with them every day, and I either like or dislike some of these senior commanders, but I'm very proud. I'm loyal to the organization, to these soldiers and what they're doing, but I've got to write about our successes and our failures and where we can be better. I think one of the ways that you do it is you got to think about, as I'm writing this history, this is for people to understand why this blood and treasure was spent, and what can we gain out of that to make us better next time. It's not going to help us this time. There's other groups, that MHDs I talked about, they're pulling lessons learned, and some of that stuff gets shared real quickly with other units coming in. They're ready. But what I was doing is for long term, and so it's more important, and I think it was not so hard to think about, just got to be, just call it like an umpire straight down the middle, because it's for the betterment of the future. But there are, everybody has we come equipped with our biases. Yes, ma'am.
Not particularly cooperative with the historian. So
that historian, and Odierno was there for nobody, no senior officer spent more time in Iraq than Raymond Odierno. He is a giant. He's a giant of a man anyway, but he is a giant in American history. He's a phenomenal commander and leader, and we owe a lot to him. His staff produced all of the documentation every day, the briefings that he sat in on, and so the historian was, so it's incomplete. To answer your question, yes, it's incomplete. He may write a phenomenal memoir someday, but memoirs are, there are issues with those too. But that historian was unable to ask him in real time the details about his actions, at least during that time. Maybe a historian before that, maybe their relationship wasn't great. I can't answer all that because Odiero was there for numerous years. But during that time, that historian failed to have that close contact that I did. Again, I was very fortunate. Jacoby, former historian, professor, he understood the importance and made sure everybody else is. But I would agree, Chris, that yeah, it's a little, that record is short a bit because of that. Yeah.
So you were talking about long-term implication, but if you were invited back to the White House after you were doing this historian visit, what advice would you give to our civilian leaders about using this information and dealing? Because I must say there was a sense of distrust of ours in the civilian population of what the civilian leaders were telling us, clearly during the Vietnam War, but then also more recently. So what advice would you give to our civilian leaders?
Well, for one, is to read deeply and in depth and in breadth of history, and not just of one conflict. And for me to try to tell them about what's going on in Iraq, they're already getting that from the, you don't need a historian to be telling them what's happening there on a day-to-day basis. But, I could tell them to read other aspects of history, other nation states, other empires, and what they're doing, and what you can learn. So read deeply and in breadth on history, but without trying to, as a lieutenant colonel, trying to tell them what to take out of this particular 6-month period. I don't think I would have delved into that. And one, I know I wouldn't have delved into that at all. But two is just to encourage that deep and abiding interest in history. It's not going to give you all the answers, but it's going to provide the basis for thought on all that. There's one right up here.
Would you comment on your opinion of whether all of this information is now stored digitally versus in the past it was in boxes of paper, and researchers going through boxes of paper, you could find things you weren't even looking for that were important, and now it's all buried in a server somewhere?
Yeah, so a great question. It was about, in the past when it was paper, and I've done this, I'm working in 18th century. Open up a box or something, and I find all kinds of other interesting material. Then you get stuck down that rabbit hole for a while. But now we got so much digitally, and there's just so much of it. Are they going to find those things? Well, yes and no. So much more. But because it's archived digitally, you can search through this stuff. You can find everything having to do with this particular name, and it comes up through all the various organizations, units, staffs, and you get access to all of that, which will be overwhelming, but then you can start going down. You're not having to hunt and peck as much. You might not do as much stumbling onto this unique, interesting nugget that you weren't even looking for. You could just start going through all the stuff and reading every day's entire reports, but you're not going to. Historians, what they're going to do is they're going to highlight all the stuff, and then they're going to search for particular things, and it will rise up to them. I was pleased for my little short time and my little contribution there to have some historians write me later saying, "Hey, sir, I'm listening to you talk right now. I hear your voices. I'm listening to your interview with so-and-so right now." Or I found this thing that you did. But it's the declassification effort is going to take forever just for the military historians, but for civilian historians to get into this it's going to take a long time. But I guess my thing is, you might not have that aha moment of some of these discoveries, but the ability to search across wide ranges of information, and so much of it is actually there.
What
What happens to the foreign, their records, or what happened to the
So you mean like
tapes?
the Iraqi records initially or something? Yeah, we do have a couple of different things. I did mention the new monuments-men type thing to find about historical artifacts that are important to keep and protect these treasures, and that's critical. But also the access to captured military equipment intelligence. Some of those records go right back into the combat. And so you find operation plans or maps or something, it goes right to the intelligence folks for them to start working their way through. Back to that Band of Brothers piece, you may remember Dick Winters found a map of all the German artillery positions for D-Day, for Utah Beach, in that assault at Breakcourt Manor. And that immediately, within hours, was in the S2's hand, intelligence, and working our way through so we could put rounds on target. So some of it is very valuable, useful information of immediate value, and it goes right to the military intelligence folks. Eventually, that is going to be, should be captured and kept and passed up into the Center of Military History, gives out guidance for each operation, each major thing, about what to keep, what we want to find out from this particular enemy. And so that stuff will be captured by the historians in combat and brought back as well, either with photographs or the actual materials. Military history detachments, those teams that are moving around the battlefield, they will gather that information up. Units bring it back. They're on a raid, they hit something, they'll bring the information back, turn it over to intelligence. It might be used immediately, or then it's collected by the military history detachment. So, yeah, we do keep that, yeah. Oh, sorry, ma'am, go ahead back here. Okay, hold on, you got the microphone real quick.
As much as you love him, who would you like to have interviewed in your past, in his past?
You can ask me anything you want.
Yeah. Jeff, come out here and sit down. You know, that is a great question, and there's, you know, for any of us historians, there's just so many. I told you I work on British Navy and politics, but in an era called the Napoleonic epic. So I would like to sit down with Napoleon and talk. There's never been Martin Van Creveld, the great Israeli historian, said Napoleon was the most competent human being who ever lived. I mean, he could do just about anything. What he'll be known for 1,000 years from now is not his great military stuff, but his societal changes, education, building canals, universities. University of Milan today, or all over, they're all run by his organizations. So I would love to sit with him. He'd throw me out after 10 minutes, but I'd love to start the conversation. Yeah, thanks.
One final question.
I heard you talking about the learnings from the work that you did. And I'm curious as to when you sent all this information back, how is it extracted so that the learnings from your experience over there could be communicated to the young officers that are currently coming out of ROTC programs or West Point or other military academies?
Right, that's a great question. And it's not just us. I talked about military history in Iraq. We also have something called the Center for Army Lessons Learned, CALL, at a Fort Leavenworth is often called the brains of the Army. There's so many centers there, the Command General Staff Colleges there. But those guys' job is to gather all of those immediate lessons, things that we're discovering about how the enemy is operating, how they're changing their tactics, what we do has been successful in combating that. They gather that up, units send it up, but they have teams out there. That is brought back to Leavenworth and then sent back out and distributed Army-wide. Some of it's electronic, most of it is now. Some of it's by paper. And then it goes to the schoolhouses, because co-located at Leavenworth is Combined Arms Center, is part of the Training and Doctrine Command, that all of the schools, ROTC, all the rest, and all the schools for like infantry and armor and field artillery or transportation, all of them fall under that commander. And so right there, he pulls those lessons up and then distributes them across, and then they come back down and go into the lesson plans of those organizations as they're teaching. So some stuff may be a matter of weeks in theater, days within a unit, of a new lesson learned, transferred over to other people. But within a year, it should be in the school system. Those are for immediate things that may not have long-term value, but those immediate lessons learned, critical. for those units getting ready to deploy. And so it goes out pretty quick.
Let me just offer one more thanks to you, because one of the things I think that's really critical for what we do at our center and what you history work is to remember, and this goes back to your question, that the most important learner of the information that you did and of the information that we write probably has not been born yet. So we don't really know what they need to know. All we can try to give them as much as we can. So support your local history center. Okay.